I was 7 years old the first time I remember standing in front of my mother's closet and feeling something I didn't have a word for. It wasn't excitement, exactly. It wasn't rebellion. It was more like recognition, the way you feel when you hear a song you've never heard before, but somehow already know the melody. Her clothes hung there in soft rows, and I remember the way the sleeve of one blouse brushed against my cheek when I leaned in to look. I didn't touch anything that day. I just stood there, breathing in the smell of laundry detergent and something floral, and I remember thinking, in the quiet way that children think without really thinking, that a part of me was in that closet too, waiting. I want to be careful here because I know how easily a story like mine can be twisted into something it isn't. This isn't a story about secrets in the sensational sense. It isn't a story designed to shock anyone. It's a story about a child who didn't understand himself, who grew into a teenager who was afraid of himself, who became an adult who finally had to sit down with himself and ask the hard questions. If you've ever felt like there's a version of you that lives just under the surface of the version everyone else sees, then maybe this story is really about you too, in some small way. That's what I hope, anyway. My childhood was ordinary in most of the ways childhoods are supposed to be ordinary. I had two parents who loved me the best way they knew how, which was the way their parents had loved them, which was to say, with a certain amount of distance and a certain amount of expectation. My father worked at a plant on the north side of town and came home tired, and my mother worked at a school and came home tired in a different way. We ate dinner together most nights. We watched television on Sundays. I had a younger sister who followed me everywhere until she was old enough to realize she didn't have to, and then she stopped, and I missed her in a way I never told her about. The first time I put on something that wasn't mine, I was 9. It was a pair of my sister's socks, the kind with little lace trim around the ankle. I don't remember why I did it. I remember being alone in the house on a summer afternoon, the kind of afternoon that feels like it lasts a week, and I remember pulling those socks up over my calves and feeling, for a moment, like I had exhaled a breath I'd been holding since I was born. That's the closest I can come to describing it. It wasn't a thrill. It was a settling. And then, almost immediately, it was a terror. Because even at 9, I knew somehow that this was something I wasn't supposed to feel. I took the socks off, folded them the way she had folded them, put them back exactly where I'd found them, and I went outside and rode my bike for so long that my legs shook when I finally got off it. I thought if I rode long enough, I could ride the feeling out of me. That was the first of many things I got wrong. For a long time after that, I didn't do anything. I want to say that plainly because I think there's an assumption that a story like this is a story of constant hiding, constant sneaking, constant transgression. It wasn't. For years, it was just a quiet awareness, a small dim light in the back of a room I never entered. I went to school. I made friends. I was, by all outward measures, a normal boy. I played baseball badly. I read too many books. I got in trouble once for talking during a fire drill, and I remember crying about it for 2 nights because I was terrified of disappointing my father. That was the shape of my childhood. There was nothing especially remarkable about it, except for the small hum underneath everything, the sense that I was carrying something I didn't understand. Middle school is where the confusion started to become something harder. I was 12, 13, 14, and everyone around me was becoming someone. The boys were becoming boys in the way the world expected them to, louder and rougher, more sure of the space they took up. The girls were becoming girls, more careful and more watched, learning a set of rules I could see being taught, but not learning them myself. And I was in the middle, watching both sides of a room I didn't feel like I belonged to. I remember once, in 7th grade, sitting in the cafeteria and looking at a girl named Rebecca, who had just gotten her hair cut in a way that made her look older, and I remember not being able to tell whether I wanted to be near her or whether I wanted to be her. That confusion was so sharp and so unfamiliar that I put my head down on the table and pretended I had a headache until the bell rang. I walked to my next class shaking a little, and I didn't tell anyone about that moment for the next 20 years. When I was 14, I found a bag of clothes my mother had set aside to donate. It was in the garage, tied at the top, and I had been sent out to look for a wrench my father needed. I opened the bag because I was curious, because I was 14 and curiosity is what you have instead of judgment at that age. Inside were some of my mother's old things, a dress she'd worn to a wedding once, a couple of skirts, a blouse with buttons shaped like tiny pearls. I stood in the garage for what felt like an hour holding that blouse, and I put it back in the bag, and I went inside and gave my father the wrong wrench because I couldn't remember what I'd been sent for. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of desire, not because of anything I could name, but because I felt like I had been shown a door I didn't have permission to open. And I knew, even at 14, that eventually I was going to open it. That's the thing about doors like that. They wait. I opened it 2 weeks later. My parents were at a church function. My sister was at a friend's house. I had told everyone I wasn't feeling well so I could stay home, and I remember the specific feeling of the empty house. The way silence in a house you're used to being loud in is its own kind of presence. I went to the garage. The bag was still there. I brought it into my room, and I closed the door and I locked it, and I sat on the floor with the bag in front of me for a long time before I opened it. When I finally did, I didn't try anything on right away. I laid the pieces out on my bed like I was studying them. I remember thinking they looked like a person who wasn't there. And then I tried the blouse on, just the blouse, over my t-shirt, and I looked at myself in the mirror on the back of my door, and I saw something that made me sit down hard on the floor and cry. It wasn't a happy cry. It wasn't a sad cry. It was the cry of finally seeing something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking. And then, immediately after, it was the cry of realizing what that meant for the rest of your life. Because at 14, in that town, in that family, I already knew that what I was seeing in the mirror was going to cost me something. I just didn't know it yet. I put everything back in the bag, and I put the bag back in the garage, and I never told anyone. The next Sunday, I watched my mother carry the bag to the car and drive it to the donation center, and I didn't say a word. That was my first real lesson in what silence costs. Because for the next several years, everything I felt, everything I didn't understand about myself, went into the same quiet place inside me, tied at the top like a donation bag, waiting to be carried somewhere I couldn't follow. High school made things both easier and harder. Easier because I got better at being someone else. I learned how to laugh at the right jokes. I learned how to walk in a way that didn't draw attention. I learned how to talk to girls in the way boys were supposed to talk to girls, and I learned how to talk to boys in the way boys were supposed to talk to boys. I was a good student. I had a small group of friends. I dated a girl named Katie for most of my junior year, and I liked her, I really did, in the way you can like someone when you don't yet know what you actually feel about anything. She was kind and funny, and she laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny, and when we broke up at the end of that year, she cried and I didn't, and I remember being confused by the fact that I didn't. I thought maybe there was something wrong with me. I thought maybe I was cold. I told myself that a lot in those years. It was easier than the truth, which was that I didn't cry because I had been performing the whole time, and you don't cry when a performance ends. You just take off the costume and go home. But that's the thing. I didn't have a home to go to, not in the sense of a self I could return to. I had a bedroom and I had a family and I had a school and I had a life. But when I closed my bedroom door at night and looked at the ceiling, I didn't know who was under the covers. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was afraid of or what he would eventually become. And that not knowing was the loneliest thing I've ever felt. I want to say that clearly because I think loneliness is often described as being without other people, and that's not quite right. The worst loneliness is being without yourself. It's living in a body you don't recognize and a name you don't answer to and a future you can't picture. That was high school for me. Not all of it, but enough of it. I did the crossdressing thing, if we're going to call it that, a handful of times during those years. I want to be honest about it without dramatizing it because I think the truth is more useful than the drama. Sometimes it was clothes I bought from thrift stores 3 towns over, paid for in cash, worn once in a locked room, and thrown away in a dumpster behind a gas station on the drive home. Sometimes it was pieces I found. Sometimes it was nothing more than a scarf tied around my neck in the dark. Every time, there was a moment of quiet recognition, and every time, there was an hour of shame that followed, and every time, I promised myself I was done. I made that promise probably 50 times between the ages of 15 and 18. I broke it every single time, and each time I broke it, I hated myself a little more for being someone who couldn't keep a promise, even to himself. I want to pause here and say something about shame because I think it's important. Shame is a strange teacher. It doesn't teach you what you did wrong. It teaches you that you are wrong, which is a different thing and a much worse thing. For years, I couldn't tell the difference between the two. I thought the shame I felt after those moments alone in my room was proof that what I was doing was bad. But looking back, I understand now that the shame wasn't about the clothes. The shame was about being seen. Not by anyone else, because no one else ever was. The shame was about being seen by myself. Because in those small, quiet moments, I was closer to the truth of who I was than I ever was in the rest of my life. And being that close to the truth, when you've spent your whole life running from it, is terrifying. Shame was just the name I gave to that fear. If I'd known that then, I would have suffered less. But I didn't know it, and so I suffered exactly as much as I did. I graduated high school and went to a state college 3 hours from home. That distance mattered more than anyone realized. 3 hours is far enough to be a different life and close enough to still be reached. I picked a school I couldn't quite afford and a major I didn't quite believe in, and I moved into a dorm with a roommate who spent most of his time at his girlfriend's apartment, which meant that for the first time in my life, I had a room that was almost entirely mine. That first semester was the beginning of what I now understand was the discovery phase, though I wouldn't have called it that then. Then I just called it staying up too late and being confused. I started reading. That's how it began for me. I read things I never would have read at home. I read essays and memoirs and articles and forum posts by people who had lived some version of what I was living, and for the first time in my life, I saw myself in words. I read about people who had cross-dressed their whole lives. I read about people who had transitioned. I read about people who had done neither and had still figured out who they were. I read the good stories and the sad stories and the complicated stories that didn't resolve into anything clean. And slowly, over months, I started to understand that whatever I wasn't the only one. That sounds like such a small thing to say. It isn't. When you spend your whole childhood believing that you are the only person in the world who has ever felt what you feel, discovering that you're not is like being handed a map of a country you thought you'd invented. I made a friend that year, my first real friend, a person I'll call Marisol because the real name doesn't matter, and because she has her own life to protect. Marisol was in my philosophy class, and she wore combat boots and painted her nails black and talked about books like they were people she knew personally. She was the first person I ever came close to telling. I didn't tell her. I want to be clear about that. But I came close enough that the not telling was itself a kind of intimacy. We would sit up late in her dorm room talking about everything and nothing, and once, at maybe 3 a.m, she looked at me and said, "You know, you don't have to be whoever you think you have to be." And I didn't answer, but I remember that sentence the way you remember a smell from your childhood. It went somewhere deep and stayed. I started, that year, to explore in a more thoughtful way. I want to describe this carefully because I think the details matter less than the shift in how I was approaching it. In high school, everything I'd done had been done in panic and shame. In college, I started to try slowly to do things without either. I would buy something small, a piece of jewelry, a scarf, a soft sweater that could pass either way, and I would wear it in the privacy of my room, and I would try not to hate myself afterward. Sometimes I succeeded. Often I didn't. But the attempt itself was new. The attempt was the seed of everything that came later. I was, without knowing it, beginning to practice the radical act of being kind to myself. I want to talk about fear now because fear was the largest room in the house of my 20s, and I don't want to skip over it just because it's uncomfortable. I was afraid all the time. I was afraid of being discovered. I was afraid of not being discovered and living a whole life without ever being known. I was afraid of my parents finding out. I was afraid of my parents dying without ever really knowing me. I was afraid of never having a serious relationship. I was afraid of having a serious relationship and having to lie for the rest of it. I was afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being seen. I was afraid of the person I was and the person I might become, and I was afraid, most of all, of the space between those two people because that space was where I actually lived, and I didn't know how to make a home in a space. I graduated college with decent grades and no real plan. I moved to a city because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do, and I got a job at a company doing work that I could describe in one sentence, but that took me 40 hours a week to actually do. I rented a small apartment on the third floor of a building where the elevator only worked sometimes, and I lived there alone. And for the first time in my life, I had a space that was entirely mine, with a door that closed and no roommate and no parents down the hall. And I discovered in that apartment that having freedom is not the same as knowing what to do with it. I had spent so many years imagining what I would do if I ever had space to be myself, and when I finally had that space, I found that I didn't know what being myself actually looked like. I had to find myself entirely by what I hid. Without anyone to hide from, I didn't know what I was. I started in that apartment to live a kind of double life. That's the phrase people use, and it's accurate, but it doesn't quite capture the strangeness of it. It wasn't that I had two lives. It was that I had one life with two languages and I couldn't translate between them. In my work clothes and my work voice, I did my job and went to happy hours and dated occasionally and pretended to be interested in sports so people would think I was normal. In my apartment, alone, I let another part of me exist. I bought a few things. I kept them in a box under my bed. I would come home on Friday nights, close all the blinds, and spend a few hours being someone I couldn't be anywhere else. And then I would put everything away, and I would sleep, and I would wake up and put on the work voice again. I want to be honest about the toll this took. Because sometimes when you tell a story like this, there's a pressure to make the middle sound braver than it was. The middle wasn't brave. The middle was exhausting. I was drinking too much on weekends and sleeping too little on weeknights. I was gaining weight and losing it in cycles that had nothing to do with my body and everything to do with my mind. I was going to work meetings and not remembering what had been discussed. I once cried in a bathroom stall for 45 minutes because a coworker had complimented my new shirt, and I didn't understand why I was crying, only that something inside me was so tired of being seen incorrectly that a small correct thing had broken me open. I remember washing my face afterward, looking in the mirror, and thinking very clearly, this is not sustainable. I remember thinking those exact words. And then I went back to my desk and I sent an email, and I ate lunch, and I told nobody. The reflection phase, if I have to name it, started with a therapist. I want to be careful here too, because I don't want to make this sound like a commercial for therapy, and I don't want to imply that therapy is the only path or even the right path for everyone. It was the right path for me. I found her almost by accident. My insurance had a list. I picked her because her office was close to my train stop, and her name sounded like someone who had a garden. Her name was Dr. Ree, and she was small and quiet and had the specific kind of stillness that made you notice how much you were fidgeting. The first session, I told her almost nothing. The second session, I told her a little more. By the third session, I was telling her things I had never said out loud, not to anyone, not even to myself in the mirror. The first time I said the word out loud, I was sitting in her office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and I had been talking around it for 40 minutes, and she finally said gently, "It sounds like there's something you're trying to say." And I said it. I said, "I've been dressing in women's clothes since I was 14, and I don't know what it means about me." I said the whole sentence out loud, in the middle of the afternoon, in a room with another person, and the world did not end. The office did not collapse. Dr. Ree did not flinch. She just nodded once and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that. Tell me more when you're ready." And I sat there and I cried quietly because I had spent so many years imagining what it would feel like to say those words to another human being, and I had always imagined it would feel like drowning, and instead it felt like standing up after being underwater for a very long time. We spent months, then years, talking about what that sentence meant. And what I learned in those years is that the meaning wasn't what I thought it would be. I had spent my whole life assuming that when the truth finally came out, it would be one truth, and I would know it, and then I would have to do something about it. Instead, the truth came out slowly in pieces, and each piece was more complicated than I had expected. I learned that I was not one thing. I learned that identity is not a fixed point but a landscape, and that walking through your own landscape is the work of a lifetime, not a weekend. I learned that some of what I felt was about gender, and some of it was about performance, and some of it was about the specific way I had been raised, and some of it was just about being a person, which is a harder job than anyone tells you when you're a child. I want to talk about my family now because I can't tell this story honestly without them. For years, I was terrified of telling my parents anything about who I was. My father is not a bad man. I want to say that first. He is a man who was raised by his father, and none of them were given the tools to talk about feelings, and so my father did the best he could with what he had, which was not enough but was not nothing either. My mother is a woman who has spent her whole life trying to keep her family together with what amounts to hope and grocery lists. I love them both. I have always loved them both. But loving people is not the same as being able to be honest with them, and for most of my life, I chose the loving over the honesty, because I was afraid the honesty would break the loving. I told my sister first. She was 28 at the time, married, living in another city, and we had a relationship that had gotten better as we'd gotten older, the way sibling relationships sometimes do when the noise of being children together finally quiets down. I told her over dinner at a restaurant, because I was too afraid to tell her at either of our homes. I gave her a version of the truth that was not the whole truth, but was more truth than I had ever given anyone in my family. I said that I had struggled for a long time with questions about who I was. I said that some of those questions had to do with gender. I said that I sometimes wore clothes that people didn't expect me to wear, and I told her I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I wanted her to know. And I remember watching her face while I talked, and I remember being ready for anything, and I remember what she actually did, which was reach across the table and take my hand and say, "I'm so glad you told me." And she was crying a little, and I was crying a little. And the waiter came over to see if we wanted dessert, and my sister waved him away without looking at him, and we sat there in the noise of that restaurant, holding hands across the table, and I remember thinking that this was the first meal I had eaten in 20 years where I was actually present in my own body. My sister was the first door. My parents were the last, and they were harder. I didn't tell them for another 2 years. I wanted to be more certain of what I was telling them, and I wanted to be steadier when I said it. When I finally did tell them, it was at their kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon in the fall, and my father made a sound I had never heard him make before, and my mother went very still, and neither of them said anything for what felt like a long time. And then my mother said, "How long have you felt this way?" And I said, "Since I was a child." And she said, "Oh, just that. Oh." Like she was fitting something into a place she hadn't known was empty. My father stood up and walked out of the room, and I thought that was going to be the end of everything. But he came back about 10 minutes later with a glass of water for me, and he set it down on the table, and he sat down, and he didn't say much for the rest of that afternoon. But he stayed. He stayed in the room. And I understood, watching him, that for him, staying in the room was as much as he could give me right then, and it was more than I had expected, and I decided to be grateful for it. The years after that were not easy. I don't want to pretend they were. My parents needed time. So did I. We had conversations that went badly. We had conversations that went well. My father asked me questions he clearly didn't know how to ask, and I answered them as honestly as I could, and sometimes he flinched, and sometimes he nodded, and slowly, over months and then years, something between us that had been broken for a very long time started, in small ways, to be repaired. It was not a clean process. Nothing worth doing is. But it was real, and it was ours, and I understood, in the middle of it, that I had been carrying a fear for my whole life that had turned out to be smaller than I thought. Not because the risk had been fake. The risk had been real. But my family had turned out to be more capable of love than I had given them credit for, and that was a gift I hadn't known I could receive. I want to talk about the acceptance phase now because I think it's the hardest one to describe honestly. When people talk about self-acceptance, they often make it sound like a moment. A day when you wake up and finally love yourself. That's not what it was for me. Self-acceptance for me was a slow negotiation that took years and is still ongoing. It was learning one small choice at a time to stop treating parts of myself like problems that needed to be solved. It was learning to sit with contradiction. It was learning that I did not have to arrive at a final answer about who I was in order to be allowed to live. It was learning that the questions themselves were part of who I was, and that trying to eliminate them was trying to eliminate me. I made choices during those years that I am proud of and choices that I am not proud of. I want to be honest about both, because I think stories that only include the good parts do a disservice to anyone who is still struggling. I hurt people. I dated a woman for almost a year without being fully honest with her about the things I was still figuring out, and when we broke up, I could see in her face that I had wasted a piece of her life on a version of me that wasn't real, and I have not forgotten that. I owe her an apology I have never been able to give her because I lost her contact information, and I think, in some way, I let myself lose it because reaching out felt like too much. That was a failure on my part. I have tried since then to be more honest earlier. I have tried to remember that other people deserve the truth about me even when the truth about me is still being written. I don't always succeed, but I try. And I think trying and admitting when you don't succeed is a big part of what being a decent person actually looks like. I also stopped, at some point, treating my exploration as something to be hidden even from myself. That was maybe the biggest single change. For most of my life, even in private, I had approached the parts of myself that I didn't understand with a kind of tactical secrecy. Even alone in my apartment, I had treated what I was doing like a crime I had to hide the evidence of. When I finally started to let myself just be, without cleaning up afterward, without punishing myself, without the elaborate rituals of shame, I found that the parts of me I had been most afraid of turned out to be, in the daylight, kind of ordinary. Not shameful, not glamorous, just human, just parts of a person. And once I could see them as parts of a person, I could start to integrate them into a whole life, instead of quarantining them into stolen hours. I want to speak now about something I have been circling around for a while, which is the question of what I actually am. I know that's what a lot of people want to know when they read or watch a story like mine. They want the label. They want the resolution. They want the moment when I say, and that's when I understood that I was. And finish the sentence. I want to be honest about this because I think the honesty here is more useful than any label would be. I am still figuring it out. I have been figuring it out my whole life, and I expect I will be figuring it out until the day I die, and I have made a kind of peace with that. There are days when I feel very strongly one thing, and days when I feel very strongly something else, and days when I don't feel much of anything and I go to work and I eat dinner and I water my plants and I am, in those moments, just a person. What I have come to understand is that the label was never the point. The point was learning to live a life that was honest with itself, and honest with the people I loved, and honest with the world in the ways that mattered. Some people arrive at a clear identity and find great peace in it, and I think that's beautiful, and I honor those people. My path has been messy, I have accepted the mess. The mess is mine. What I can tell you, clearly and without qualification, is what I have learned. I have learned that identity is not a costume you take off and put on, but it is also not a prison you have to stay locked inside of. It is closer to a language you are learning to speak. You get better at it over time. You make mistakes. You find words for things you couldn't describe before. Sometimes you have to unlearn what you were taught. Sometimes you have to invent new grammar. And the goal is not to become fluent in the way someone else defines fluency. The goal is to be able to say true things about yourself, in whatever words you have, to whoever needs to hear them, including you. I have learned that shame is not a moral compass. It feels like one when you're young. It feels like proof that you're doing something wrong. But shame is very often just the residue of other people's fears, poured into you before you could refuse it. Learning to tell the difference between shame and actual moral wrongdoing is one of the most important things you can do as an adult. When I hurt that woman I dated by not being honest with her, the guilt I felt was real, and it was pointing at something I needed to change about my behavior. That was moral information. It was useful. But the shame I had felt as a 14-year-old, sitting alone in my room with a blouse I had put on and taken off in the space of 10 minutes, was not moral information. It was just fear that had been dressed up as a rule. Untangling those two took me most of my life. I want you to be able to untangle them faster. I have learned that family is more complicated and more resilient than we give it credit for. My parents did not respond perfectly when I told them. My father took a long time to find his footing. My mother had questions she never quite asked out loud, and I think she carried some sadness for the version of a son she had expected and did not get. But they stayed. They kept showing up. They came to dinners. They asked, awkwardly at first, and then more easily, about my life. My father, on a phone call 2 years ago, told me he was proud of me. He had never said that before about anything, and he did not elaborate, but I understood, and I said thank you, and I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen for an hour without moving. Family is not always what we hope it will be, and sometimes it is worse than we hoped, and sometimes it is much better, and often it is all three at once. What I have learned is that the version of my parents I had feared for most of my life turned out to be a version that only existed in my imagination. The real people were more limited in some ways and more capable in others, and giving them the chance to be real people instead of the imagined judges I had built in my mind was one of the best things I ever did for both of us. I have learned that friendship, real friendship, is worth being honest for. I lost a couple of people when I started being more open about myself. I want to acknowledge that because I think stories like mine sometimes gloss over the losses. Some people I had been close to for years drifted away, and one person I had been very close to stopped answering my messages, and I never got an explanation, and I probably never will. That hurt. It still hurts, honestly, when I think about it. But the friends who stayed were friends who had actually known me, or who were interested in knowing me, and the friendships that grew after those losses were deeper than anything I had let myself have before. I would rather have 3 people who know me than 100 people who know the version of me I could perform. That is a trade I have made deliberately, and I have not regretted it, even on the days when the losses still ache. I have learned that mental health is not separate from any of this. For most of my life, I treated my mental health the way most people are taught to treat it, which is to say, I ignored it until it broke. When I finally started paying attention, I understood that a lot of what I had thought was my personality was actually just untreated anxiety and depression that had grown up around me like ivy around a house until I couldn't see the house anymore. Getting help changed things. Not overnight. Not miraculously. But over time, the ivy came off and there was a house under it, and the house needed some repair, but it was mine. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. If you are struggling and you have been struggling for a long time, please talk to someone. Not because it will fix everything. It won't. But because you deserve to know what your life feels like without a weight you didn't choose sitting on top of it. I have learned that responsibility to yourself and responsibility to others are not opposites. This is something I got wrong for a long time. I thought that being honest about who I was would automatically mean hurting people. I thought that taking care of myself would automatically mean disappointing my family. I thought that the two things were in a zero-sum relationship and that I had to keep choosing between them, and that choosing myself would make me selfish. I was wrong about that. The truth is that hiding who I was hurt people too. It hurt the people I dated, who deserved a full partner. It hurt my parents, who deserved a real relationship with their real child. It hurt my sister, who deserved to know the brother she actually had, not the one I was pretending to be. Honesty, done with care, is not selfish. It is the beginning of every real relationship. Selfishness is a specific thing. It is prioritizing your own comfort at the expense of others in ways that you have not been honest about. Honesty, even difficult honesty, is not that. Honesty is the ground that everything else has to be built on. I wish someone had told me that earlier. I am telling you now, in case no one has told you yet. I have learned that patience with yourself is a skill you have to practice. When I first started really examining my life, I wanted to solve it in a weekend. I wanted to have all the answers by the end of the month. When I still didn't have them by the end of the year, I felt like a failure. When I still didn't have them by the end of the decade, I started to understand that maybe the whole idea of having them was the wrong framework. Some things you don't solve. Some things you live with, and you get to know, and you make room for. The room they occupy in your life changes over time. The urgency changes. What was once a 5-alarm fire becomes a small, familiar heat you can sit next to. That doesn't mean it goes away. It means you have learned to live with it, and living with it is often the only real answer. I have learned that other people's opinions of you are none of your business, and this is one of the hardest lessons of all. I want to be careful here, because I don't mean this in the tough guy way it is often used. I don't mean that you should be indifferent to how you affect the people around you. You should care. Deeply. But there is a difference between caring about your impact on someone and caring about whether they approve of you. The first is love. The second is a cage. I spent decades in the cage. I care now about how I affect people, and I try to be gentle, and I try to be honest, and I try to repair when I have caused harm. But I have stopped mostly trying to earn approval from people whose approval was never going to be given freely, and I have found that once you stop trying to earn something that cannot be earned, you have a great deal of energy left over for other things, including for actually loving the people around you. I want to say something about integration because I think that is the phase I am in now, and it is the one I understand the least. Integration is what comes after you have discovered and feared and reflected and accepted. It is the work of taking all the pieces of yourself and letting them live in the same life. It is not about becoming a single, coherent thing. It is about letting the various parts of you be in the same room without any of them having to leave. I have days now where I go to work and do my job and come home and cook dinner and read a book and go to bed, and none of it feels like a performance. That's new. That's still new. Even after years. There are still days when I feel the old fear, the old pull toward hiding, the old habit of pretending. But those days are fewer than they used to be, and even on those days, I know now that the hiding is a habit, not a necessity. I know now that I have another option, and having another option changes everything, even when I don't choose it. If you are watching or reading this and you are somewhere in the earlier phases, I want you to know a few things. I want you to know that where you are is not where you will always be. I want you to know that the questions you cannot yet answer will, most of them, eventually become questions you can live with, even if you never fully answer them. I want you to know that the people you are most afraid of losing may surprise you, and the people you thought would always be there may not be, and that is a hard truth, but it is also a survivable one. I want you to know that whatever you are figuring out about yourself, you deserve to figure it out without hurting yourself in the process. Self-loathing is not a moral discipline. It is a wound. Please do not confuse the two. I want to say something specifically about young people because I think about them often. If you are young and you are feeling some version of what I felt, please talk to someone. It does not have to be a parent. It does not have to be a teacher. It can be a therapist, a school counselor, a helpline, a trusted friend, a member of a community that has done this kind of work before. The specific person matters less than the fact of speaking. Silence was the most expensive thing I ever bought, and I paid for it in years I cannot get back. Please do not spend as much as I spent. There are people who will listen to you without judgment, and finding one of them is one of the most important things you can do. I want to say something specifically about parents too, because there may be parents watching or reading this who are trying to figure out how to be there for a child who is going through something like what I went through. What I would say from the other side is this. You do not have to understand everything to love someone. My father did not understand a lot of what I told him. He still doesn't entirely, but he showed up. He kept coming to dinner. He asked awkward questions and listened to awkward answers and did not walk away, even when I could see that some of what I was saying was hard for him. That was enough. That was more than enough. If you are a parent and your child is telling you something you don't understand, you don't have to have the right words. You have to have the willingness to stay in the room. That is the thing. That is the whole thing. I want to say something also to the people who have never felt any of this, who have read this far out of curiosity or care. Thank you. I mean that. The world gets kinder every time someone chooses to try to understand a life they have not lived. You do not have to agree with everything I have said. You do not have to arrive at the same conclusions I arrived at. But the simple act of listening, of trying to imagine what it might be like to be a person you are not, is one of the most quietly powerful things any human being can do. If you have done that today, you have contributed to a version of the world I want my future self to live in. So thank you. I want to circle back to that 7-year-old, standing at his mother's closet, feeling something he didn't have a word for. I think about him often. I think about how afraid he was going to be and how long he was going to carry that fear alone, and how much time he was going to lose to shame that was never really his to carry. And if I could speak to him, if I could reach back through all the years between us and put my hand on his shoulder for just a moment, I would tell him this. I would tell him that he is not broken. I would tell him that the feeling he cannot name is going to be, eventually, one of the most important things he ever learns to name. I would tell him that the people he is most afraid of are, most of them, capable of more love than he can currently imagine. I would tell him that the road is long, and it is going to be lonely for a while, but that he is not, in the end, alone, and that other people have walked something like this road before him, and that he will one day find them, and they will become his family in a way that expands rather than replaces the family he already has. I would tell him that he is going to make it. Not because he is stronger than other people, but because he is not weaker than other people, and other people have made it, and he will too. And I would tell him one more thing, which is the thing I most want you to hear, whoever you are, and wherever you are in your own story. I would tell him that the point of his life is not going to be to figure out what he is. The point of his life is going to be to figure out how to love the people around him and himself more fully and more honestly than he currently knows how to. The figuring out what he is part is going to happen along the way, in pieces, sometimes clearly and sometimes not. But it is not the main event. It is not the destination. It is scenery on the way to the actual work, which is love, which is honesty, which is the daily practice of being a person among other people. I am 41 years old now. I live in a small apartment in a city that is not the city I was born in. I have a job that I mostly like. I have a garden on my balcony that I am always slightly failing to keep alive. I have a small circle of people who know me, and I have a family that has grown into knowing me, and I have a self that I have grown into knowing too. There are days when I feel entirely at home in my life, and days when I don't, and I have come to understand that this is the range of what being alive actually is. I do not have a dramatic ending to give you. I am not going to tell you that I finally became one thing and lived happily ever after. Real life is not shaped like that. Real life is shaped like a person waking up each morning and deciding, again, to try to be honest and to try to be kind and to try to make room for whatever they discovered about themselves the day before. That is the shape of my life now. It is a smaller and quieter shape than the shape my fear used to draw for me. And it is mine. I want to end with something my therapist said to me once, near the end of a session, on an afternoon I don't remember much else about. I had been talking about how tired I was of always trying to figure myself out, of always working on this thing that felt like it should have been finished a long time ago. And she looked at me and she said, "You are not a problem to be solved. You are a life to be lived." And I've thought about that sentence probably 1,000 times since she said it. Because it is true, and it is simple, and it is the thing I most needed to hear when I was 7 and 14 and 18 and 25 and 30. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a life to be lived. Whatever your version of that life looks like, whatever questions you carry, whatever secrets you are still keeping and slowly learning how to release, please remember that. You are not a problem. You are a life. And the living is the whole point. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.